It's really an honor to be here, and Scott and I are very grateful that we've been welcomed into this space. The conversation last evening was intimate and engaging, and I so appreciate the ability to have that, the chance to have that with you, and those of you who were here, thank you for that beautiful engagement. So this morning I'm going to talk about creating a world beyond the beliefs that divide, and speak particularly about those people who already live in that world and how it is that we might be more present to them. I'm going to tell you about a beautiful place that I go every summer for a week. It's called Chautauqua, and it's in Upper New York State. It's now an enclosed institution that works all around the year to present 9 weeks of themed discussions. So each week you are there for a week, and your lectures could be on any number of topics related to those 4 things. So you might be looking at the world through the eyes of National Geographic, or you may be talking about geopolitical realities in the current age, or you might be talking about Iran, or you might be talking about the Abrahamic faiths. So this year, I was privileged to be there for 2 weeks, because one of those weeks I was the chaplain at the denominational house for the United Church of Christ. And I was very excited because the theme that week was called Crisis of Faith, ? I did that right for you, didn't I? Yes, ? And they focused a lot on that question mark rather than on the crisis, which is what I had hoped they would focus on. But while I was there, I was privileged to hear a number of speakers at the main lecture, which is at 10:45 in the morning, draws anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000, 6,000 people in an open-air amphitheater. And there I heard Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who you will know, and I heard Eboo Patel, who started the Youth Interfaith Ministries, and other speakers as well. And then in the afternoon, in another area, under an open pillared pavilion called the Hall of Philosophy, the religion department presents lectures every afternoon throughout the week. And Bill Moyers was the person for that week, and he interviewed a number of other people. And many of you will know Bill Moyers and the work that he's done on spirituality and exploring those themes. And he was interviewing interesting people as well. Robbie Jones, who is the founder and CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute in the United States, with whom I'd been in contact for probably over a year at that point, and who published the book, The End of White Christian America, just in the summer of 2015, just before 2016, just before the elections in the States. He was interviewed and brought his understanding of the religious landscape in the United States. Greg Epstein, who is a secular humanist at Harvard University, he was one of the speakers. Rabbi Sid Schwartz, a Reconstructionist Jew, spoke as well. And Alan Cooperman was also interviewed by Bill Moyers. Alan Cooperman, have any of you heard of Pew Research? Pew Research puts out demographic research across a broad spectrum of items and areas of society in the United States. And Alan Cooperman is the head of the religion study area. So he does the same kind of thing as Robbie Jones, but probably with a bigger budget. So he looks into the religious landscape, watches how it's changed, raises up some of the concerns and interests that people will find stimulating. And so I follow his work just as closely as I follow Robbie Jones's work. And Alan Cooperman and Robbie have both noticed that there is this incredible rise in the number of people who proclaim to have no religious affiliation. They call them the nuns, and some of the nuns appreciate that label, some of the nuns don't appreciate that label. But that's the language that was used predominantly at that themed week that year, last summer. One of the things that I found very interesting in that week was that the nuns were identifying themselves as they asked questions. There's a very standardized procedure for asking questions of speakers after the morning lecture. Questions are either sent in by Twitter or they are collected on pieces of paper and then collated and answered as the MC determines which is the most important to send forward. But what was interesting was that people were prefacing their questions with, I'm a nun, N-O-N-E, I'm a nun, and I feel this, and here's my question. Or, I'm an atheist, and here's my question. Or, I don't go to church, I'm not part of any religion, and here's my question. So for the first time in the many years that I've been attending Chautauqua, these people were identifying regularly in the Hall of Philosophy where they came up to microphones, or in the amphitheater where they sent their questions in by Twitter or on paper. And that was a new thing. It may be the result simply of the theme of the week, but it's also the result of the fact that that demographic, people who identify as having no religion, is on the rise. In Canada in 2011, the number was almost 24%. If you add the people who identify as Christians, but who say that they're Protestants, I always assume they really don't know what they are if they put down Protestant, that it means that they don't really go to church or they know what denomination they were part of. That number continues to grow. So if you add those, I think we're probably over 25% now. Do any of you know what the percentage of nuns in the UK is? You're over 50%. Over 50% of your population identifies as having no religious tradition that they identify as part of. And in fact, for each person who grows up in a religious household and then decides that non-religious household, and then decides to follow a faith tradition, regardless of what that is, for every one of them, 25 people who were raised in a religious household leave religion, which is an incredible kind of sea change, right? It makes a very big difference in our society. Of the 49% who identify as atheist or agnostic of that percentage of nuns, 49% of them identify as atheist and agnostic, and 3% identify as spiritual but not religious. I think the religious community has hung on to that category, that there are people out there who are spiritual but not religious, and we can draw them into our churches if we just do things a little differently. But that's a very small percentage of that group. And you're welcome to chase them if you like, but I really think the demographic that needs our attention is the demographic that has no religious affiliation and is not regularly coming into communities of faith for what those communities of faith might offer. Some of that stuff about the percentage that are leaving religion comes from Stephen Bullivant, who is a professor of theology and sociology of religion at St. Mary's University in Twickenham. We don't have towns in Canada that have such charming names, unless we've pulled them from here, but Stephen calls them non-verts. So they've converted away from religion, so they're non-verts is the word that he uses for them. So after Alan Cooperman's lecture, a gentleman approached the microphone and was a bit perplexed. And he said, okay, so what are these nuns interested in? Who are the gods of the nuns? And Alan thought for a moment and shrugged his shoulders and said, shopping? And I was pretty upset about that. In fact, a woman in the audience who had heard that approached me later because I had identified what my beliefs were, and she said, "Did you hear that question? Did you hear what he said?" And shared it with me again, and she said, "I was about to put my umbrella through his eye." And sure enough, she had an umbrella that she was about ready to do that because she was an atheist. And she resented the fact that he suggested that the only thing she was interested in was shopping. I'm not sure whether it's just that Alan had misread the audience, and because it was Chautauqua, which is primarily white, well-heeled, and Christian, that he just assumed everyone there was a believer, and so he discounted the non-believers, and thereby very seriously misjudged his audience. Or if he really doesn't know who the nuns are and what it is in which they are interested. I think it's the latter, because there hasn't been any real study of what that group is, other than just identifying whether they're atheists or agnostics or spiritual but not religious. There hasn't been any in-depth study of what their interests are. So I'm going to take that leap and suggest that I know what it is they're shopping for, and Robbie Jones is going to start doing some of this work with the Public Religion Research Institute to determine what it is that the nuns are looking for. And I don't think it's anything very extraordinary. I think what the nuns are shopping for, if they're shopping at all, are the same things that we are shopping for regularly, and that many of us get when we come into communities of faith. And those are the standard things that are basic human needs. They're basic human needs recognized and addressed within a close community of people who recognize us and allow us to belong. And they're looking for communities in which they can be stretched to be the best people that they can possibly be. That's what I would suggest that they might be looking for, if they knew that it was possible and if they thought that it could happen in communities such as this. So if we think about what basic human needs are, the first thing that comes to mind is Maslow's triangle. We talk about our basic physiological needs, shelter, food, clothing. When those things are met, we begin looking for security, then for love, then for belonging and esteem and self-actualization or self-realization. Many of us who have been engaged in religious communities for most of our lives, if not all of them, find ourselves fairly high up that triangle. We're at the point where we consider our religious institutions allow us and celebrate the journey towards self-realization. We're wanting to find out more about the world, about our place in it, about the relationships that we create through our lives, about how they feed and support us and how we feed and support other people. We're very high up on that triangle. And when we're way up there on that triangle, our responsibilities are often found to those who are lower down on the triangle. How do we care for people and make sure that they're fed, that they're clothed, that their basic needs are met so that they too can move up that triangle? And I have concerns that the nuns are barely making it, that outside of community and isolated, they're dealing predominantly with things lower on that triangle because their lives are more hectic and more challenging than ours ever were. I am the governor for a community college in Toronto, and so I'm privileged to go to a summit every year that brings together people to speak about higher education concerns. And a couple of years ago, Bill McKibben, who is the founder of 350.org, a climate organization, reminded us, those of us in the audience, that when we were in school, we could assume that 25 or 30 years down the road, we would be in the peak years of our career. That if we wanted to be teachers, or if we wanted to work in retail, or if we wanted to be in sales, in insurance, or if we wanted to be in banking or nursing or the medical profession, we graduate from school, and in 25 or 30 years, we would be at the peak of that career. And he suggests that that isn't so for those who graduate now. And many of you, if you have children or grandchildren who have finished high school or college or university, they go out into their field, and you know that that field is going to shift and change over time because the kind of work that was available to us simply isn't available anymore. And because the nuns are very often isolated, they don't have an opportunity to come together to do the kind of work that we do. My son lives in a home with 4 or 5 other people his age. I expect that's, unless he decides to move into a permanent relationship, I think that might be the way he lives out the rest of his life. In a group that some identify as an urban tribe, people who come together and just live in the same space, and that becomes their family of sorts, takes the place of some of the bonds that we've had in our communities. But they're experiencing different things. And the nuns, the age of the nuns, if you sort them according to age, you'll find that they're very high in the ages under 25, under 35, very high. As they get to our age, they're lesser but still significant. But we're talking predominantly about a younger generation. So I want to look at some of the things that I believe are important in that self-realization triangle that we're in, that we would have all humans allowed the privilege of belonging there, that their human rights be protected, that their human needs be met, so that we can be at the place where we are making the world for ourselves, for others, and for the world itself a better place. And I'm going to use the structure that I used in my book, Amen, around prayer to talk about that. Amen, which I think is the better of the two books, just an inside tip there, because it works through through the course of what church offers in terms of prayer. I think that allows us to see more clearly how religion has grown up around basic human needs, things that we thrive on in our own lives. So I used the acronym ACT when I wrote the book to identify the 4 major kinds of prayer that you will experience in a church service mostly. Prayers of confession, or prayers of adoration. When we come into the space, many spaces are created in order to instill a sense of awe in us. Scott and I have been looking at cathedrals as we've found extra time here. And you walk into a cathedral which is built almost exclusively to provide you with this sense of smallness and the awe and majesty of the divine. So adoration is one of the very first kinds of prayers that you'll experience in a service through calls to worship, prayers of approach. And then following that, once you recognize how very puny you really are in the nature of that universe, you confess your sins. And so confession is another element prayer that's used within community. And then the next one is thanksgiving. Once you've confessed and you're worthy of hearing the word, and you do hear that word, then you can offer your thanks for being offered that word and being able to implement it in your life, and the opportunity to do it again, to be enriched again, so that those thanksgivings are expressed. And then prayers of supplication. So there's adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication when we lay out what our needs are and we express them in community. So those are the 4 things. Well, how do they tie to basic human needs? I think that religion wrapped very well around human needs. So the first one, when it's adoration, what is it that we crave in our lives, that we need in order to get into that self-realization triangle? I believe it's a sense of awe. We need to have wonder in our lives. We need to be able to look at the universe, look at our relationships, look at ourselves in the mirror, and be completely awed by what it is we see, who it is we have become, the person with whom we are in relationship, the world around us. It pulls us out of ourselves and stretches our understanding incredibly. Awe is an important part of being human. Just strip your life of the idea of awe, and it only takes a second or two to realize how crucial that is to you. That without awe, our lives would be very, very different. So the prayers of adoration are meeting the need, very human need for awe. The prayer of confession is an opportunity for us to reflect upon ourselves. And at West Hill, we shared last night how we talk about being in right relationship with ourselves, with others, and with the planet. So being able to take the time to reflect on those relationships. Where have I done that well? Where have I fallen short? What is it I could do again? We have words of commitment that we say at West Hill that I often suggest people tape to their bathroom mirror And in the morning, they read them and think, okay, how can I sort my day out using those principles and trying to live by them? And at the end of the day, when you have to face that mirror again, you read them again and you think, oh, well, I could have done that better. Reflecting on our lives, taking a few minutes to reflect on what it is that we've done each day and where we've celebrated and where we've fallen short is an important thing. But in our daily day-to-day lives, we rarely stop to really look at that. And we are those who have been steeped in a tradition that calls us to do that. So if you haven't been steeped in that tradition, if you have no religious tradition that calls you to look at yourself, to confess, if you want to use that dreadful word, who's going to remind you that that's an important thing to do? Is that going to just come out of yourself that, okay, now I have to really think about what I did today and whether I did it well? I think that we actually let people skip over that and skip over it regularly. So our next kind of prayer is thanksgiving. And of course, we all know that gratitude is a basic human need. For us to build relationships and do it well, we need to be able to express gratitude to those who have privileged us with their presence in our lives, to those organizations that have supported and sustained us, just for whatever's happening in our life, to be able to recognize that it's a gift, creates in us a perspective that is different. Again, strip gratitude from your life and imagine how your relationships would be different, how your sense of responsibility and accountability to would be different if there was no gratitude in your life. And finally, the supplication, which are prayers of need. If we cannot express our need, if we do not have around us people who can hear our need or honor our need and recognize that it's important, then we are very isolated. And my fear is that many people are very isolated in their ability to express their need. We tend to enjoy looking at the younger generation and just saying, oh, they're so self-centered. They just, whatever they want, they get it. They don't have to work for anything because, it all comes to them on their phone. And that's absolutely not the case. I think that younger people often are afraid to name what it is that they need and may need external organizations to do that. In Amen, I bring all of that together in a recognition of what God has provided us in our religious institutions. And I talk about goodness and how God has been the source of all goodness in the world. We've identified God as the source of goodness, but also as the agent by which goodness comes into the world. This happened to me because God allowed it to happen, or God made it happen, or God brought that person into my life so that it would happen. God is the source of what is good and the agent by which that good comes into the world. And then we look to God as the promise that good will out, whether it's going to happen next week and we win the lottery, or whether it's going to happen in 5 years when when our children become successful and finally move out of the house, or whether it happens when we die, that goodness will out. That's the promise that God makes to us. But in a world that doesn't have a supernatural interventionist God working within it, we have our own responsibilities. We are the source of goodness in the world because we name what is good and what is not. And if you've got the replication of the kind of flowers that you want in your garden, that's a good thing. If you've got replication of cells in your body that have gone rogue, that's a very bad thing. We name what is good and what is bad and make it so. Those are both indifferent to us. They're both just things that happen. And we identify one as good and one as very, very nasty. So we are the source of goodness mostly because we name what is good. We are also the agents by which good comes into the world. And many of us who have used theological constructs in the past often say, you are the hands and feet and mouth of God. You're the person that God is going to use to make the world a better place. We'll take God out of that story, and you are still the only way that good is going to come into the world. Good comes into the world through you. You make it happen. And so you are the agent of goodness. But when it comes to the promise of goodness, we fail miserably. because we can't promise that everything is going to work out. We can't promise that the dreams that we have are going to be fulfilled, even if those dreams are totally altruistic and are about creating a better world. We don't know that those will happen. We can put our all into it. We can be the potential for good, but we can't promise goodness. So these are the elements of religious community that I think are important. And why is this, why do I come through all of this when I'm talking about the nuns, and particularly that younger generation of nuns? I think it's because the world in which we live and move, and in which we work, and in which we gather to celebrate and to be in relationship with each other, that world is a world that is on trial right now, weighed down by so many difficult things that are happening within it. I'm going to talk about some of them this afternoon. But religion, which has always grown up around human need and pasted a story onto the human condition that we can grasp hold of, and story and narrative is so important to us in terms of understanding our world. Religion has wrapped it and made it real for us in the past. But what wraps it now? What narrative can be used to make it real for those people who are outside of church, and why does it matter? And is the job that we're about, is our job saving church? I don't think that it is. But it may be that our work is to provide the kinds of communities that people who want nothing to do with church might find helpful, through which they may sense their own belonging, through which their needs, as I've identified them before, partly through the concept of prayer and partly through the basic human needs, might be met. And how do we create that, and are they happening at this point in time? One of the benefits that I think church has done, and people sometimes ask me why I stay in the church, or why did I become ordained anyway when my understanding of God was non-theistic and I didn't seem committed to the traditional understandings of church. And it was because I was drawn to the breadth of engagement that the church offered. I was wanting to be engaged in justice work in a broad way. And the church offered so many opportunities for that, while still lifting up awe and gratitude and thanksgiving, but naming those needs in the world and providing a tool that could engage people in creating that world. Early in my period of time at West Hill, and I've been there slightly over 20 years, we reviewed my job description. And the outreach that I was to oversee as a clergy person was the work that the church did. We had a dinner program once a week where we gleaned food from local hospitals, from their cafeterias, and redistributed it to families in the community. We had a number of programs that brought people to the church. They had just finished about 25 years of an English as a second language program that they were sharing with the community. We were engaged with work around the shelter system that lined the road that we were situated on. And we shifted that idea of outreach. I call that Dutch door outreach, where we just open the top and people come to the door and we give them what they need. And our work shifted to become an exponential outreach, in that we were to transform people's lives so that they would go out, and no matter where they were, they would engage, they would offer change, they would be the change that was needed in their communities. And they've done that in an incredible way. People who have worked in jobs that they felt were mundane and trying have moved into jobs that are community changing, engaging in new ways. People who are in jobs that provided them a sustainable and then some standard of living have used that excess to make change in the world. Each individual that comes to West Hill is transformed by the work that they are exposed to, both by the leadership, but very much so by the people they are in the pews with, to do that outreach from their hearts, wherever they are, to be part of that work. And this is the kind of work that we want to do. So where are the nuns getting that kind of engagement? I'm on the board of the Oasis Network. I think I briefly mentioned it last night. The Oasis Network came into being in 2012 when Mike Aus, the clergy of a small community church, he had been ordained into the Lutheran Church, but was leading in a small community church, resigned on a Friday evening and came out on the Monday morning on national television, MSNBC, as an atheist, which shocked those who were members of his congregation because he hadn't shared that information with them. And the congregation decided to close. I think they didn't want the public scrutiny, and they didn't think they had the capacity to call another minister, so they closed. And a few weeks after that, one of the members of the church contacted Mike and said, "I want my church back. Like, I don't care what you believe or you don't believe. I want my church. I need that in my life." And so Mike and that individual and a couple of others met for a few weeks, and then they launched a community that they called Houston Oasis. And when they launched it, they had well over 100 people show up for that first gathering. They now sustain a membership of well over 200, which brings in about 200 people on a Sunday morning. And they do all the kinds of things that church does. But about a year and a half after Mike launched the Houston Oasis, somebody sitting in Kansas City Googled atheist church and came up with Mike's Houston Oasis, called him. Mike called back and that shared some ideas about what they had done. And Helen Austin in Kansas City, Missouri, launched an Oasis community about 3 months later with 225 people coming to the first meeting. Since then, 4 Oasis communities have opened in Utah, which most of them made up of former Mormons. They've launched communities in Boston, in Austin, Texas, I can't tell you them all, but there's about 15 of them now functioning, and we launched one in Toronto a year ago, and almost a year ago. Those communities are drawing people who want to be in community, who know the value of being in community. And in 2010, Robert Putnam and Cheyenne Lim did a study diving deeply into the benefits of religious community, because subjective well-being, as it's expressed by people who are in religious communities, is much higher than it is for people who don't go to church. And they wanted to know why. So they went through all those studies and did a deep dive and did their own studies and found that people flourished in religious community when they made lots of social contacts. When they went to church every Sunday, or if they didn't go to church every Sunday, they connected at least with the community once or twice a week. This is important because every study shows that people who don't go to church are less likely to donate to charitable causes, less likely to volunteer in their communities, less likely to, you probably don't have snow here, less likely to offer an umbrella to someone who's walking in the rain, less likely to just be friendly to strangers, and less likely to vote, considerably less likely to vote. So when those who identify with having no religious tradition are over 50% of your population, if they're less likely to vote, you have a very vulnerable political system, which can easily be swayed by a particular group with a particular agenda, as you might be seeing has happened south of our border in Canada, has happened in the United States of America, where the largest voting bloc are the nuns, but the nuns don't go to the voting booth. So bringing people into community, as the Oasis communities are now doing, is establishing for those people who don't have belief places where belonging, being recognized, making those kinds of social connections, and empowering individuals to act in the community in a bigger way. They are the world beyond the beliefs that divide. They simply need the connections that create a social legacy, a social democracy that we have enjoyed in Canada and that you have primarily enjoyed here in the UK. Without that, you're a vulnerable community. So while the Oasis Network, and my end game is not to bring multiply Oasis networks. My end game is what Oasis networks give back to the world. The United Church of Canada came into being in 1925, and it's had a profound effect on Canada, which was only 50 years old at the time, 60 years old at the time. It was a very young country. And we have had an incredible influence on what that democracy turned out to be, that social democracy that is Canada. Because the United Church, like every liberal religious institution, has mitigated the argument in the center of our communities, that moral fabric by which our communities are constructed. And it has countered the religious fundamentalists, and they have countered the radical libertarians, and they have woven a place where justice is worked out and stretched, and human rights are extended, and the conversation can take place. But as those liberal churches begin to crumble and lose traction, and more people flow into that conversation, highly influenced by fundamentalist narratives and libertarian narratives, that social democracy is at risk. And so that's my end game. End game is to make sure that social democracy stays intact. It's about creating people that can go out and hold that fabric of community together, who can strengthen it and ensure that it is there for their children and for their children's children, so that the world in which we can each have a voice and each contribute and each be present continues, and that we don't start stifling voices, start carving off segments of the human family because of a fundamentalist religious perspective, or ignoring the needs of whole segments of populations in our world because of libertarian pleasures being driven by those who have, the generation that is currently privileged to have them, perhaps denying them to following generations. Those are very real issues in the world in which we live now, and they're extremely important. I'm going to end there, I think, and then enter into some conversation. I think that it's important that I hear where it is you are through your questions, so that I can respond and to what it is that you're interested in learning about this group of people, most of which I don't know, but some of which I'm willing to speculate about, or what it is you're doing in your community that you think could be stretched or shaped or moved to engage this group of people who are beyond the church walls and live in that world beyond beliefs.
Were you saying that the nuns are quite different from those who say they're spiritual but not religious?
I would say so. The spiritual but not religious, of course, are included in that number. But the spiritual but not religious are generally looking for something that may or may not have a supernatural or other source of power, and that's often why they identify like that. We did talk a little bit about the word spiritual last night, and how it's, it's embraced and not embraced, and embraced and not embraced. Some people feel that spirituality has to do with, as Scott was saying, meaning, culture, and values. Julie shared her definition was that which is at the very essence of our humanity. But many people also see it as something that has to do with yoga or some of the other more New Age practices, because people are looking for guidance and for efficacy in their lives. So the spiritual but not religious is a very real group, and some of them probably would be humanists and some of them not. But it's a smaller portion of that larger group of people than we would like to believe. I think there's a lot of work happening by those who are writing for church, who are writing with the purpose of shifting church to create programming and offer things that will attract the spiritual but not religious as an opportunity for growth or even for survival. But I don't know that that population is big enough, and I don't know that they're looking for exactly what it is the church offers. So they're not separate from, they're a part of, but they're not a huge part of. Thank you.
Just remembering back from when David Cameron was in office, he was a great advocate of the big society. Do you remember? And some of that was to sort of buffer services that would possibly otherwise have failed. But that big society concept hasn't really continued now with our new leader. And it's interesting that it was recognised that volunteering, helping others, these sorts of things was necessary. But I think it's very, very sad, really. It's just a comment I'm making. It's very, very sad, really, that hasn't been pursued and continued, really, as a...
And that's a brilliant concept. If we can, as this article says, we need a common narrative, right? We need a common narrative. I mentioned Loyal Rue last night, the philosopher, American philosopher, and he talks about religion as a noble truth, a noble lie. And he does a lot of work around, how nature lies to survive. So you have bugs that look like sticks, and you have sticks that look like, flowers, and you have animals that look like trees, because nature disguises itself in order to allow it to survive, right? And that's our basic desire, all living things, is to survive. So he argues, though, that religions are failing, that those narratives are crumbling, and that they're no longer compelling for larger and larger groups of people. So he argues that we need a new noble lie, a new narrative that can bring people together, like the narrative of big society, maybe. I firmly believe that we know enough about ourselves. We will never know everything, but we know enough about ourselves, about society, about the emergence of humanity, out of the evolutionary conspiring of those things that came before us, to be able to tell a noble truth that I think could be compelling. And that truth is more about cooperation and empathy and those things that have developed as evolutionary traits that allowed us to survive. Religion was certainly one of them, but as I say, it grew up around the things that we needed. So our new narrative could be a truth that is so profound that we are all ultimately tied together, and we see our common humanity in one another, regardless of the many ways in which we can stratify society, and are to want to do on occasion. But I love that, the big society narrative. I think it's an important one. Yeah, thank you.
Just wondering how to express two questions, a bit cheekily. First of all, is the fact, you say that what we do is more important than what we believe, another way of talking about justification by works, and what does justification mean? And my second question, if I may, is meditation and what's the new...
Mindfulness.
Mindfulness. Is this the new religion of the Western world?
Okay, two things. One, the Lutherans and the Catholics agreed to find common ground 500 years later. So they're 5 imperatives that they have come up with in order to try to compel all of their membership toward one another, include finding unity, looking for what brings us together rather than what is going to tear us apart, and finding those things that we have in common rather than those things that are different. So creating a common vision together and not act on that. So, and part of that is the justification by works, right, versus justification by faith. So I think that if they can do that, we can certainly figure that one out ourselves. But I do think that there is a combination of those two things that is imperative for us. If faith means not a religious faith, but a belief that we can, that united we will, that there is a possibility. And I'm not dewy-eyed about it all coming true by and by. I'm very, very concerned about the future and about my grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren, or that 7th generation, and what kind of world we're giving them. So I don't think that it's all going to be, butterflies and flowers and butterflies and stars and things like that. I think we have much work to do, and I think that there's going to be much lament in the human family through the generations to come. But But I do think that there has to be something that could be identified as faith, justification, if you want to use that word, by the belief that there is more, that there is much more that we can be as a human family. So I think that's a very important narrative. But I think that the justification by works is equally important, because it's not just going to happen if we sit down and say, well, oh, look at that, isn't that nice over there? Oh, yeah, oh, no, that didn't go so well. You know, we have to be doing as well. So we have to have this narrative, and then we have to work to make it real. No narrative is fulfilled in and of itself. So that's those two things. And the other one was mindfulness and meditation. Those are extremely important things. We have a brain that has not existed until we were here. And we have a part of that brain that shoves thoughts to the back, to our limbic system, where we react as reptilian as we want to get, or we can send the train forward to the frontal lobes. If we don't spend time in serious reflection and renewal and mindfulness, perhaps, that train doesn't work so well going this way. And we end up reacting to things rather than creating a response to them. Mindfulness has been shown to have an incredible impact on strengthening that part of our brain and making it available for us for use in times of need. And we're learning constantly about that. Just the magnetic resonance imaging that has allowed us to watch what the brain is doing in different circumstances tells us that meditation and mindfulness are extremely important, and they can help us live out the values that we identify, because we will do it intentionally, and we will do it with more facility if that part of our brain is done. So I meditate on a daily basis, using a mindfulness program is the way that I do that. And that's a very important part of my remaining whole in a day-to-day way. Thank you for that.
How compatible is a spirituality of cooperation compatible with capitalism, which is rooted in the principle of competition?
Very good question. Did everyone hear that? Okay. How compatible is the spirit of cooperation with the spirit of capitalism, which is generally competition? I think that's a very good question, and sometimes it seems that they're extremely at odds, right? And I think the tragedy of the commons brings that together and says, how can we survive this? I think that we have to be deeply entrenched in the oversight of capitalism. And capitalism now is not, I don't think capitalism is even strong anymore. I think corporatism is what we're living with now, which is far more dangerous than capitalism. I think that there is an advantage to be brought to celebrating creativity and celebrating human endeavor, and capitalism allows us to encourage that. I also think that the principles of socialism are equally important, that those whom we encourage to benefit society in certain ways are benefiting society. So there are opportunities for that feedback loop to happen so that we move. It's like humanity is a blanket, and we can't just keep lifting one corner because everything spills off. We have to try to find ways to lift all the corners. And capitalism, a shared responsibility between capitalism and socialism can bring that about, but I think we have to be vigilant about corporatism and really ensure that corporatism does not become the new capitalism, which I think it actually may already have done. But corporatism influences so many things. I mean, look at the gun laws in the United States, which are promoted by corporate interests. Not capitalist interests, and certainly not socialist interests, though they may argue that that's what they're doing. So I think that we need to be vigilant about that, and I think that's an excellent question. Thank you.
Hi, Gretta. Like you, I think many, if not most of us here today are probably members of established Christian churches. Why should we stay with these traditional faith communities rather than doing what your friend in the Oasis Network did and build a new community beyond traditional faith?
That's some of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, so I don't want to get into it too much, but I think it's a both and. I think that we need to do both of those things. Maybe remaining in our traditional communities and getting the nurture and sustenance that we do from there, and being part of a movement that creates these communities for those who are not going to come in the door. In Canada, transitioning a community, that's the work I was about. Those are the resources that I'm creating for people who may want to transition communities. But I'm not sure, I mean, we started this work 16 years ago, and our community is pretty much 16 years older now. And I'm not sure that the 16-year-older community has the capacity to transition at this point in time. So I think that it's important to do both things, because in order to stabilize our communities, and I don't mean our faith communities, I mean our broader communities, we're going to have these groups of younger people coming together to be together and to be changed and transformed by that togetherness. I went to the Oasis Summit at the end of July in Denver, and it brought together people from all of the different Oasis communities to share, best practices, things that have worked for them, that have engaged them. And I was ancient compared to that demographic. Like, I was so old, I stuck out like a sore thumb. They were predominantly between 25 and 35 or 40, maybe a few 45. But it was a very seriously younger crowd. And I'm not sure that transforming our communities will bring people in. In Toronto, we planted a community downtown, and we're on the very eastern edge of the city. And people drive from beyond us, past us, to the Oasis community, because we're a church. And it doesn't matter what we do inside there, we're still a church. So they're not going to come. So I think it is a both and. We've got to do both things at the same time. Thank you.
Something I've noticed,
Pull that down a little bit, yes.
over the last, 20 years, seems to me to indicate a great need for comfort, for religious comfort. And what I've noticed in connection with death, when people are bereaved, they really need comfort. And I guess in all sorts of places, I noticed that when someone dies in an accident or somewhere, people go and put flowers there, or maybe something that the person's known. On public land near me, there are often almost little shrines created with flowers or something that was familiar to the person, or a little verse. And I wonder what, the comforts of religion are obviously not available to these people. So if you don't believe in God and your loved one dies, what happens to them? So what does the non-religious but spiritual attitude take to people who have these needs, which are not being met, I don't think?
I think that's a very serious question. I think many of you probably know someone who has died and asked for there to be no service. Do you have familiarity with that? Or just the C&E just does it anyway? Okay, yeah, people die and there's no service because they have no connection to a religious institution, and if they go to a funeral chapel, they'll set you up with a minister, and they don't want the minister. They don't want what the minister is going to do. So they end up having nothing, and that's the loss of a very important part of the grief process, is bringing a community together around that. So I am very clear with my congregation that I have no idea what happens when we die. I haven't done that yet, so I can't tell you. There might be something, there may not. I tend to think that there's going to be nothing. There's a beautiful piece in Philip Pullman's trilogy, in The Subtle Knife, I think, which is the last one of the Golden Compass series, when Lara is in that waiting place where people have died and they're waiting for this promise to come true. that they've been fed, and nothing has happened, and they've been there forever and ever. And she uses the knife to slice and let them go out into the world. And they go out, and as they go out, they dissipate into all the elements and settle within the world in that. And it's a beautiful, beautiful portrayal of what might happen when we die. Not the waiting place thing, that was pretty awful, but the being released and becoming part of the carbon nature of reality out of which we originally came. So I do services for individuals, and often I'm called by a funeral home to do something for someone who is not religious, and they know that I can provide something for that. And because the structure of a normal funeral service doesn't fit, not just the language, but the structure is foreign, I will try to bring out of the family what needs to be provided. So, you know, so I do different things that meet those needs. So once was a shooting victim, had been killed in a drug raid by the police. And 20 minutes before he was killed, he had phoned his mom to make sure that she followed up on some paperwork that needed to be done so he could get into his pastry chef program at the college, which he was to start in September. And 20 minutes later, he was dead. So at that service, one of the first things I did was use the F word, because I wanted the people who were there to know that they didn't have to clean their language up in front of me if they wanted to talk about their friend and their grief. They could say whatever they wanted to do. And at the end of the service, I invited them to come up, and I put a little spread of cornstarch, because it sticks, on their clothing. And I said, you know, I'll put this on as a reminder, you know, the next time you pull this out of the closet, that's going to be there, and it's going to remind you that one decision can make all the difference in the world. And all these thugs, you know, they were incredible people, and I thought they'd laugh at me, really. But every one of them stood in a lineup to have that smear put on their shoulder, because they need a sign of something, right? And I didn't make them any promises that they were going to see him again, nothing like that. But as a community, they now had something that they could recognize and use. And so that's the kind of thing that I would do for a family that had no religious tradition. Since I have said that I don't know what happens when we die, I have had incredibly more rich conversations with people who are approaching death, because they don't think that I'm thinking something and they have to believe that. So we have engaging conversations about what might happen. An 8-year-old had leukemia, and her mom called me because she couldn't sleep at night, because she knew her mom didn't believe that there was life after death, and so she was afraid she was just going to disappear. She couldn't cope with that. So we came up with 6 or 7 stories that Kathy could tell her daughter, and her daughter could choose one that she wanted to believe, knowing that none of them were true. And she chose one that was then her story, and she could sleep at night. I bought Scott a star for his birthday, because he can't cope with the idea that the world would go on without me. Isn't that lovely? So he couldn't cope with that idea, so I bought him a star, and now he's got a star. I'm going to be at that star, right? So there are stories that we tell ourselves that help us cope with whatever the reality might be.
is such a privilege to hear people in a whole different country sing a song like that. Thank you for how you sang that. We go together very well in the meaning of that. I'm going to have you try the one above it, the one we do at a time of bereavement, and it is number 56, and it is called Farewell. And I called the tune, I believe, For Wayne, to keep it personal. You don't know Wayne, but you know a Wayne, someone in your life that has passed away and is no longer with you. So this might have been your song at the time. Became a song about my mom. She passed away after that. And she may not have agreed with what we were doing, but she would have resonated with those words. And that's the idea of songs for anyone. in a state school for any child of any background, and they could sing that song with full gusto because they would mean it, if they meant it. And so the only thing, if you're against love, compassion, justice, and integrity, you might not like the songs. But that's what is, so that was what it was. And then I have found the same gusto, and even sometimes a little bit more, because they're not translating in their head, saying that's not what I mean by this and this. So that's how it happened. And there was people that got mad. I mean, one man in my old life that I played the piano for a great deal, he was a wonderful soloist. He said in every church he's been in, he thought of the music department as the war department, because there's so many opinions, and you can step on people's toes very easily in music, especially people that think they can sing and they can't. That happens a fair bit. But the idea of music is so emotional, so personal. So, I mean, I love those. I raised my daughters on those beautiful hymns. But if we can take those words and make them for anyone, then they gain something. When I have a Christmas service, we do a longest night service, and I have a Christmas sing-along. And we've changed the words to the carols just slightly so that anyone could sing them. But we invite anyone to sing the other words if they like. Like, there's no, don't say that, you know. But so that's another part of the invitation. Sing what you like. But here's a way you can sing it and mean it. So that's right for you.
We did initially begin changing the words of traditional hymns, just tweaking them or taking agency out of them. So it's not, we weren't just saying going from God will do this to love will do this, because that still assumes agency. So we wanted to remove that. So we changed a lot of traditional hymns. And then it was brought to Scott's attention that those people who wrote those hymns had a passion for the Lord, for their understanding of God, for their faith, that perhaps it was inappropriate for us to trim that away.
Tweak their words.
And so, although we had the right to do it because they were in the public domain, and you'll find some of them in the book, Sing It Forward, I began rewriting whole new words to the traditional tunes. So I have an Excel sheet that has, 50 traditional tunes that are well known, and I've rewritten new words to probably 25 of them or 30. The language we offer is so common, it's such common language, that it doesn't privilege a theistic or a non-theist or an atheistic or secular humanist perspective. People find what they want in it. So the traditional believers at West Hill hear us talking about how they are compelled to live by the God that they believe in, and they hear me telling them that. And those who are not believers hear me, challenging them to live out a life of, right relationship in every place that they can. So the language isn't an issue.
I've been giving these vote of thanks for the last few years, and I must admit, some years it's a bit of a tough call, but not tonight. Julie began the evening by saying that the term atheist was a defining word. Well, Gretta and Scott, in your considered, honest, moving, and loving sharing, you've certainly helped me to revisit my definition of it. Both of you have challenged us, as Scott challenged Gretta about infant baptism, for example, to make us question our understandings, our practices, our values, our meanings. Gretta, you began by saying you hoped that there would be a rich engagement this evening. Well, I've found our time together to be provocative, mainly because of the challenge about and can it be, being a Methodist, but mainly enriching. So I'm saying to everyone, come back tomorrow and hear Creating a World Beyond the Beliefs That Divide. I'm looking forward to that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.